Once in a time, the British Empire was seen as the strongest power in history, holding control over almost half the world. Many regions grew tense the moment they heard the name of the English Empire. But as the years moved on, Britain slowly began losing its lands, and today it has let go of nearly half the world it once ruled. In this video, we'll take you through that fall step by step and show how Britain lost regions that were once the pride of its empire. Every part of this breakdown carries important details, so try not to skip anything. Now let's go back to where it all began. When the world's biggest empire got too heavy to carry. A map once dipped in red across oceans and continents looked like it could last forever. Yet beneath that bold color was a weight even an empire couldn't hold. Britain stretched itself across nearly half the world, convinced that distance and dominance were the same thing. But behind the glory sat a growing pressure. Territories too far apart, responsibilities stacked too high, and a system that demanded more than any nation could endlessly give. The empire looked powerful on paper, but the cracks were forming long before anyone admitted it. At its height, the British Empire stood as the largest in recorded history, covering nearly a quarter of Earth's land and ruling over 412 million people by 1913. Its reach extended through dominions, colonies, protectorates, mandates, and trading posts scattered across every continent, creating a network so vast that daylight never failed to shine somewhere on its lands. Yet maintaining such distance-spanning control came with enormous costs, requiring vast sums of money, fleets of soldiers, and complex administrative systems just to keep the machinery running. Britain relied heavily on naval strength and global trade dominance, what many called Pax Britannica, to hold everything together. But as the early 20th century arrived, new powers like Germany and the United States surged forward, challenging Britain's once unquestioned economic lead and quietly signaling that even the mightiest empire could feel the strain of its own size. The spark that lit the fuse, 2 world wars and one exhausted Britain. History doesn't always crumble in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it softens first, then snaps when the pressure becomes too much. Britain entered the 20th century believing its power was unshakable, but the world had other plans. The first spark wasn't a rebellion or a lost colony. It was a war so massive, it drained even the strongest nations. World War I pulled Britain into a storm that stretched its military, emptied its treasury, and consumed its manpower. When the dust settled, the empire still looked enormous, yet something vital had been chipped away. Britain was no longer the supreme industrial or military force it once claimed to be. And before it could recover, a second global conflict struck even harder. World War II battered the empire across continents, with Japan sweeping through British colonies in Asia and the fall of Singapore exposing a weakness the world had never seen from Britain. The economy collapsed under wartime costs, and survival became so difficult that Britain depended on a massive $3.75 billion loan from the United States, money that wouldn't be fully repaid until 2006. By the time the war ended, Britain wasn't just tired. It was financially drained, strategically humbled, and standing on the edge of a decline no amount of pride could reverse. The day the colonies realized Britain was no longer invincible. Empires don't collapse the moment they weaken. Collapse begins when the world finally notices. For centuries, Britain carried an aura of untouchable strength, a reputation so deeply rooted that entire nations believed resistance was pointless. That myth shattered almost overnight during World War II. When Japan swept through British territories in Asia with shocking speed, it exposed something the empire had spent generations hiding: vulnerability. And when Singapore, Britain's so-called Gibraltar of the East, fell in 1942, the world saw undeniable proof that the empire could be defeated. That single moment sent a shock through colonies everywhere, from India to Ireland, Palestine to Kenya. Movements that once whispered now spoke boldly, fueled by the realization that Britain no longer held unbreakable power. The war had drained Britain not just financially, but militarily, leaving it without the strength to quash rising uprisings or restore the fear that once kept its territories silent. In the years that followed, independence movements grew faster and louder, each one strengthened by the understanding that the empire's shield had cracked and that it might never be mended again. India breaks the chain, and the rest of the empire follows. Every empire has a moment when its greatest prize becomes the beginning of its undoing. For Britain, that moment was India. For generations, India had been the empire's proudest symbol, its richest territory, its largest population, its jewel in the crown. Yet beneath the surface, political pressure was building. The Indian National Congress pushed relentlessly for full independence, while the Muslim League demanded its own separate nation, and Britain found itself caught between forces it could no longer control. What was meant to be a slow, managed transition suddenly became a race against unrest. Britain had planned to withdraw by 1948, but the rising tension and threat of widespread violence forced that date forward to the 15th of August, 1947. The hurried exit split the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, triggering one of the largest migrations in human history and waves of violence no one was prepared for. But India's independence didn't just reshape South Asia, it shook the entire empire. Colonies across Asia and Africa watched the unbreakable crown lose its most precious jewel and realized that freedom was no longer impossible. One by one, nations that had been silent for decades stepped forward, creating a domino effect that Britain had no power left to stop. Rebellions become revolutions when subject nations stopped asking politely. There comes a point when people stop waiting for freedom and start taking it back into their own hands. After World War II, colonies that once petitioned, negotiated, and hoped for reform reached that breaking point. Across the empire, the tone shifted, from request to demand, from patience to action. And when those demands were ignored, they erupted into revolts that Britain simply wasn't prepared for. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising tore through the colonial system with raw anger. In Palestine, tension turned into open conflict as communities fought to shape their future. In Malaya, a communist insurgency dug in for a long and costly struggle, while Cyprus became another battleground Britain struggled to contain. Between 1945 and 1965, these weren't isolated sparks. They were part of a global surge in anti-colonial resistance. Many of these uprisings grew violent, and suppressing them drained massive amounts of money, soldiers, and political strength, resources Britain no longer had. The empire had survived centuries of challenges, but this wave was different. It became painfully clear that ruling by force was no longer sustainable, and every rebellion reminded Britain that its grip on the world was slipping faster than it could react. America and the USSR pushed Britain out of the driver's seat. An empire can survive internal pressure for years, but it struggles when the world around it changes faster than it can adapt. After World War II, Britain stepped into a landscape it no longer controlled. Two new giants, the United States and the Soviet Union, now defined global power, and neither had any intention of letting an old empire dictate the rules. Britain's military strength had faded, its economy was weakened, and its global influence had shrunk at a pace it couldn't reverse. The United States, once Britain's junior partner, now held the financial power and political leverage to steer Britain's decisions, often pushing it toward decolonization, unless Cold War strategy required a temporary exception. At the same time, the Soviet Union eagerly framed European empires as symbols of oppression, turning global opinion against old colonial systems. In this new ideological battleground, ruling far-off populations became not only expensive, but increasingly unacceptable on the world stage. Britain knew it couldn't navigate this era alone. It relied heavily on American loans, political backing, and international support just to stay afloat. The empire hadn't merely weakened. It had been nudged out of the driver's seat entirely, forced to follow the direction set by two rising superpowers. The empire switches to a bargain version, the Commonwealth experiment. When ruling slipped out of reach, Britain tried something new: influence without control. The Commonwealth was born, not as an empire, but as a fragile patchwork of old ties and new independence. Did it work? That depends on who you ask. This is where Britain tried to reinvent itself. As the formal empire unraveled and colonies gained the independence they had long demanded, Britain quickly realized that its only path forward was to reshape the old imperial structure into something less commanding and far more voluntary. This new model became the Commonwealth of Nations, a loose association of former colonies that chose to remain connected through shared history, culture, and diplomatic cooperation rather than through political domination. Countries like India, Pakistan, Ghana, and Malaysia stepped into this new framework soon after independence, creating a global network bound more by choice than obligation. Britain attempted to strengthen these ties through measures like the British Nationality Act of 1948, which offered a sense of continued belonging within this reimagined community. Although the Commonwealth lacked the authority or power of an empire, it allowed Britain to maintain relevance on the world stage through soft power, shaping relationships, fostering trade, and preserving influence without the heavy cost or controversy of direct rule. Economics hit harder than armies ever could. Armies didn't break the empire. Money did. After wars, shortages, and decades of overspending, Britain faced a simple truth: it could no longer afford to run the world. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, financial, and unavoidable. Here's how economics delivered the final punch. By the end of World War II, Britain wasn't just weakened, it was functionally bankrupt. The immense web of colonies that once symbolized glory had become an expensive burden, demanding constant military presence, sprawling administrative structures, infrastructure upkeep, and steady financial subsidies just to remain functional. Instead of generating wealth, many territories now drained a treasury already hollowed out by war. Britain's industries struggled to recover, shortages haunted the population, and national debt soared to levels the government couldn't ignore. The math no longer worked. Maintaining an empire thousands of miles wide cost far more than it returned. And while rebellions and independence movements shook Britain's grip, it was economic collapse that quietly, decisively pushed the empire to let go. The financial strain was relentless, leaving no realistic path to hold on to distant lands when the homeland itself needed saving. The final wave, Africa walks out the door in the 1960s. The 1960s hit Britain like a tidal surge. One African nation after another stepped into independence, and the empire's map emptied at a speed no one expected. This wasn't a slow fade. It was a powerful wave that carried the last pillars of empire out the door. Ghana opened the decade early in 1957, and by 1960, Nigeria followed, signaling a shift too big for Britain to deny. Soon, Kenya stepped forward in 1963, and then Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, Uganda, and many others joined the rapidly growing list of newly independent states across the continent. Britain had already sensed the momentum shifting, a reality captured in what leaders called the wind of change, a force moving through Africa far stronger than political promises or colonial plans. Internal pressures, mounting revolts, rising expectations, and the ever-present strain on Britain's finances made holding on to these vast territories impossible. Global opinion leaned heavily toward self-determination, and Britain understood that resisting the wave would only create more instability. By the late 1960s, the transformation was nearly complete. Almost every African colony had claimed its sovereignty, leaving Britain with a shrinking footprint and a clear message that the age of empire was ending for good. When holding on cost more than letting go. By now, the empire was running on memory, not might. Britain faced a choice: cling to distant lands at growing cost, or release them before everything crumbled. What followed was reluctant acceptance. The empire had reached a point where holding on made less sense than walking away. Years of conflict had taken their toll, and even the most loyal defenders of imperial rule could see the math no longer worked. Colonial wars in places like Kenya and Palestine drained money, manpower, and political patience, showing that trying to enforce dominance through force would only accelerate collapse. The government slowly shifted from resisting independence movements to managing them in a controlled, peaceful way, hoping to guide each transition rather than lose control entirely. Politicians recognized the empire as economically unsustainable, especially in a world reshaped by two global wars and the demands of modern recovery. Britain began to prioritize stability over possession, focusing on helping former colonies build reliable, non-communist governments that could withstand Cold War pressures. With finances stretched thin and unrest spreading faster than solutions, Britain finally acknowledged that preserving the empire risked pushing the entire nation toward economic disaster. Letting go wasn't an act of generosity, it was survival. The empire shrinks into a memory. From the world's greatest power to a handful of scattered territories, the fall happened faster than anyone imagined. By the late 20th century, the empire existed mostly in textbooks and fading maps. This closing chapter shows how a global ruler became a historical echo. Hong Kong's return to China in 1997 marked the moment the old empire finally closed its doors, a symbolic transfer that confirmed Britain no longer held the authority it once used to shape continents. What followed was a landscape reduced to just 14 small overseas territories, tiny fragments compared to an era when the empire covered a full quarter of Earth's land. Today, the British Empire survives mainly as a historical and cultural legacy, its political control almost completely gone. Yet its influence is still scattered across the world through constitutions built on British legal systems, languages shaped by colonial history, and institutions rooted in old imperial structures. Even so, the pace of decline remains one of the most striking parts of its story. In under 50 years, a global powerhouse transformed into a memory, leaving behind not a ruling empire, but an imprint carried by nations that once lived under its flag. Empires rarely end with a single moment, yet Britain's rise and fall show how quickly power can shift when history decides it's time. From unmatched global reach to a quiet collection of distant territories, the British Empire's journey reminds us how fragile dominance truly is. If you enjoyed exploring this story and want more deep dives into the world's hidden histories, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching and hanging with us till here.